The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 6, Side 1. The Persian historian al-Tabari praised Khosrau's penetration, knowledge, intelligence, courage, and prudence, and put into his mouth an inaugural speech well invented, if not true. He completely reorganized the government, chose his aides for ability regardless of rank, and raised his son's tutor, Buzurgmir, to be a celebrated vizier. He replaced untrained feudal levies with a standing army disciplined and competent. He established a more equitable system of taxation and consolidated Persian law. He built dams and canals to improve the water supply of the cities and the irrigation of farms. He reclaimed wastelands by giving their cultivators cattle, implements, and seed. He promoted commerce by the construction, repair, and protection of bridges and roads. He devoted his great energy zealously to the services of his people and the state. He encouraged, compelled, marriage on the ground that Persia needed more population to man its fields and frontiers. He persuaded bachelors to marry by dowering the wives and educating their children with state funds. He maintained and educated orphans and poor children at the public expense. He punished apostasy with death, but tolerated Christianity even in his harem. He gathered about him philosophers, physicians, and scholars from India and Greece, and delighted to discuss with them the problems of life, government, and death. One discussion turned on the question, what is the greatest misery? A Greek philosopher answered, an impoverished and imbecile old age. A Hindu replied, a harassed mind in a diseased body. Khosrau's vizier won the dutiful acclaim of all by saying, for my part, I think the extreme misery is for a man to see the end of life approaching without having practiced virtue. Khosrau supported literature, science, and scholarship with substantial subsidies, and financed many translations and histories. In his reign, the university at Jundi Shapur reached its apogee. He so guarded the safety of foreigners that his court was always crowded with distinguished visitors from abroad. On his accession, he proclaimed his desire for peace with Rome. Justinian, having designs on Africa and Italy, agreed, and in 532 the two brothers signed an eternal peace. When Africa and Italy fell, Khosrau humorously asked for a share of the spoils, on the ground that Byzantium could not have won had not Persia made peace. Justinian sent him costly gifts. In 539 Khosrau declared war on Rome, alleging that Justinian had violated the terms of their treaty. Procopius confirms the charge. Probably Khosrau thought it wise to attack while Justinian's armies were still busy in the west, instead of waiting for a victorious and strengthened Byzantium to turn all its forces against Persia. Furthermore, it seemed to Khosrau manifest destiny that Persia should have the gold mines of Trebizond and an outlet on the Black Sea. He marched into Syria, besieged Hierapolis, Apamea, and Aleppo, spared them for rich ransoms, and soon stood before Antioch. The reckless population from the battlements greeted him not merely with arrows and catapult missiles, but with the obscene sarcasm for which it had earned an international reputation. The enraged monarch took the city by storm, looted its treasures, burned down all its buildings except the cathedral, massacred part of the population, and sent the remainder away to people a new Antioch in Persia. Then he bathed with delight in that Mediterranean which had once been Persia's western frontier. Justinian dispatched Belisarius to the rescue, but Khosrau leisurely crossed the Euphrates with his spoils, and the cautious general did not pursue him. This in 541. The inconclusiveness of the wars between Persia and Rome was doubtless affected by the difficulty of maintaining an occupation force on the enemy's side of the Syrian desert or the Taurus range. Modern improvements in transport and communications have permitted greater wars. In 3 further invasions of Roman Asia, Khosrau made rapid marches and sieges, took ransoms and captives, ravaged the countryside, and peaceably retired, this from 542 to 543. In 545, Justinian paid him 2,000 pounds of gold, or $840,000, for a 5-year truce, and on its expiration 2,600 pounds for a 5-year extension. Finally, in 562, after a generation of war, the aging monarchs pledged themselves to peace for 50 years. Justinian agreed to pay Persia annually 30,000 pieces of gold, or $7.5 million, and Khosrau renounced his claims to disputed territories in the Caucasus and on the Black Sea. But Khosrau was not through with war. About 570, at the request of the Himyarites of southwest Arabia, he sent an army to free them from their Abyssinian conquerors. When the liberation was accomplished, the Himyarites found that they were now a Persian province. Justinian had made an alliance with Abyssinia. His successor, Justin II, considered the Persian expulsion of the Abyssinians from Arabia an unfriendly act. Moreover, the Turks on Persia's eastern border secretly agreed to join in an attack upon Khosrau. Justin declared war in 572. Despite his age, Khosrau took the field in person and captured the Roman frontier town of Dara. But his health failed him. He suffered his first defeat in 578 and retired to Ctesiphon, where he died in 579 at an uncertain age. In 48 years of rule he had won all his wars and battles except one, had extended his empire on every side, had made Persia stronger than ever since Darius I, and had given it so competent a system of administration that when the Arabs conquered Persia they adopted that system practically without change. Almost contemporary with Justinian, he was rated by the common consent of their contemporaries as the greater king, and the Persians of every later generation counted him the strongest and ablest monarch in their history. His son, Hormizd IV, from 579 to 589, was overthrown by a general, Bahram Kobin, who made himself regent for Hormizd's son, Khosrau II, in 589, and a year later made himself king. When Khosrau came of age, he demanded the throne. Bahram refused. Khosrau fled to Hierapolis in Roman Syria. The Greek emperor Maurice offered to restore him to power if Persia would withdraw from Armenia. Khosrau agreed, and Ctesiphon had the rare experience of seeing a Roman army install a Persian king, this in 596. Khosrau Parvez, or victorious, rose to greater heights of power than any Persian since Xerxes, and prepared his empire's fall. When Phocas murdered and replaced Maurice, Parvez declared war on the usurper in 603 as an act of vengeance for his friend. In effect, the ancient contest was renewed. Byzantium being torn by sedition and faction, the Persian armies took Dara, Amida, Edessa, Hierapolis, Aleppo, Apamea, Damascus, this from 605 to 613. Inflamed with success, Parvez proclaimed a holy war against the Christians. 26,000 Jews joined his army. In 614, his combined forces sacked Jerusalem and massacred 90,000 Christians. Many Christian churches, including that of the Holy Sepulchre, were burned to the ground, and the true cross, the most cherished of all Christian relics, was carried off to Persia. To Heraclius, the new emperor, Parvez sent a theological inquiry. Khosrau, greatest of gods and master of the whole earth, to Heraclius, his vile and insensate slave. You say that you trust in your God. Why then has he not delivered Jerusalem out of my hands? In 616, a Persian army captured Alexandria. By 619, all Egypt, as not since Darius II, belonged to the King of Kings. Meanwhile, another Persian army overran Asia Minor and captured Chalcedon in 617. For 10 years, the Persians held that city, separated from Constantinople only by the narrow Bosporus. During that decade, Parvez demolished churches, transported their art and wealth to Persia, and taxed Western Asia into a destitution that left it resourceless against an Arab conquest now only a generation away. Khosrau turned over the conduct of the war to his generals, retired to his luxurious palace at Dastagerd, some 60 miles north of Ctesiphon, and gave himself to art and love. He assembled architects, sculptors, and painters to make his new capital outshine the old, and to carve likenesses of Shirin, the fairest and most loved of his 3,000 wives. The Persians complained that she was a Christian. Some alleged that she had converted the king. In any case, amid his holy war, he allowed her to build many churches and monasteries. But Persia, prospering with spoils and a replenished slave supply, could forgive its king his self-indulgence, his art, even his toleration. It hailed his victories as the final triumph of Persia over Greece and Rome, of Ormuzd over Christ. Alexander was at last answered, and Marathon, Salamis, Plataea, and Arbela were avenged. Nothing remained of the Byzantine Empire except a few Asiatic ports, some fragments of Italy, Africa, and Greece, an unbeaten navy, and a besieged capital frenzied with terror and despair. Heraclius took 10 years to build a new army and state out of the ruins. Then, instead of attempting a costly crossing at Chalcedon, he sailed into the Black Sea, crossed Armenia, and attacked Persia in the rear. As Khosrau had desecrated Jerusalem, so now Heraclius destroyed Clurumia, birthplace of Zoroaster, and put out its sacred, inextinguishable light, this in 624. Khosrau sent army after army against him. They were all defeated, and as the Greeks advanced, Khosrau fled to Ctesiphon. His generals, smarting under his insults, joined the nobles in deposing him. He was imprisoned and fed on bread and water. 18 of his sons were slain before his eyes. Finally, another son, Shoroya, put him to death in 628. 3. Sasanian art. Of the wealth and splendor of the Shapurs, the Kavads, and the Khosraus, nothing survives but the ruins of Sasanian art. Enough, however, to heighten our wonder at the persistence and adaptability of Persian art from Darius the Great and Persepolis to Shah Abbas the Great and Isfahan. Extant Sasanian architecture is entirely secular. The fire temples have disappeared, and only royal palaces remain. And these are gigantic skeletons, with their ornamental stucco facing long since fallen away. The oldest of these ruins is the so-called palace of Ardashir I at Firuzabad, southeast of Shiraz. No one knows its date. Guesses range from 340 BC to AD 460. After 15 centuries of heat and cold, theft and war, the enormous dome still covers a hall 100 feet high and 55 wide. A portal arch 89 feet high and 42 wide divided a facade 170 feet long. This facade crumbled in our time. From the rectangular central hall, squinch arches led up to a circular dome. A squinch is a diagonal arch mediating between the upper corner of a polygonal structure and the rim of a superimposed circular or elliptical dome. Cresswell thinks this device was invented by the Persians. By an unusual and interesting arrangement, the pressure of the dome was borne by a double hollow wall, whose inner and outer frames were spanned by a barrow vault. And to this reinforcement of inner by outer wall were added external buttresses of attached pilasters of heavy stones. Here was an architecture quite different from the classic columnar style of Persepolis, crude and clumsy, but using forms that would come to perfection in the St. Sophia of Justinian. Not far away at Sarvastan stands a similar ruin of like uncertain date, a facade of 3 arches, a great central hall and side rooms covered by ovoid domes, barrow vaults, and semi-cupolas serving as buttresses. From these half-domes, by removing all but their sustaining framework, the flying or skeletal buttress of Gothic architecture may have evolved. Northwest of Susa, another ruined palace, the Ivani Karka, shows the oldest known example of the transverse vault, formed with diagonal ribs. But the most impressive of Sasanian relics, which frightened the conquering Arabs by its mass, was the royal palace of Ctesiphon, named by the Arabs Taki Kisra, or Arch of Khosrau. It may be the building described by a Greek historian of AD 638, who tells how Justinian provided Greek marble for Khosrauis and skilled artisans who built for him a palace in the Roman style, not far from Ctesiphon. The north wing collapsed in 1888. The dome is gone. 3 immense walls rise to a height of 105 feet, with the facade horizontally divided into 5 tiers of blind arcades. A lofty central arch, the highest, 85 feet, and widest, 72 feet, elliptical arch known, opened upon a hall 115 by 75 feet. The Sasanian kings relished room. These ruined facades imitate the less elegant of Roman front elevations, like the theatre of Marcellus. They are more impressive than beautiful, but we cannot judge past beauty by present ruins. The most attractive of Sasanian remains are not the gutted palaces of crumbling sun-baked brick, but rock reliefs carved into Persia's mountainsides. These gigantic figures are lineal descendants of the Achaemenid cliff reliefs, and are in some cases juxtaposed with them, as if to emphasize the continuity of Persian power and the equality of Sasanian with Achaemenid kings. The oldest of the Sasanian sculptures shows Ardashir trampling upon a fallen foe, presumably the last of the Arsacids. Finer are those at Naksh-i-Rustam, near Persepolis, celebrating Ardashir, Shapur I, and Bahram II. The kings are drawn as dominating figures, but, like most kings and men, they find it hard to rival the grace and symmetry of the animals. Similar reliefs at Naksh-i-Rajeb and at Shapur present powerful stone portraits of Shapur I and Bahram I and II. At Takibustan, Arch of the Garden, near Kermanshah, 2 column-supported arches are deeply cut into the cliff. Reliefs on the inner and outer faces of the arches show Shapur II and Khosrau Parvez at the hunt. The stone comes alive with fat elephants and wild pigs. The foliage is carefully done, and the capitals of the columns are handsomely carved. There is in these sculptures no Greek grace of movement or smoothness of line, no keen individualization, no sense of perspective, and little modeling, but in dignity and majesty, in masculine vitality and power, they bear comparison with most of the arch-reliefs of imperial Rome. Apparently these carvings were colored. So were many of the features of the palaces, but only traces of such painting remain. The literature, however, makes it clear that the art of painting flourished in Sasanian times. The prophet Mani is reported to have founded a school of painting. Firdausi speaks of Persian magnates adorning their mansions with pictures of Iranian heroes. And the poet al-Buturi, who died in 897, describes the murals in the palace at Ctesiphon. When a Sasanian king died, the best painter of the time was called upon to make a portrait of him for a collection kept in the royal treasury. Painting, sculpture, pottery, and other forms of decoration shared their designs with Sasanian textile art. Silks, embroideries, brocades, damasks, tapestries, chair covers, canopies, tents, and rugs were woven with servile patience and masterly skill, and were dyed in warm tints of yellow, blue, and green. Every Persian but the peasant and the priest aspired to dress above his class. Presents often took the form of sumptuous garments, and great colorful carpets had been an appanage of wealth in the East since Assyrian days. The 24 Sasanian textiles that escaped the teeth of time are the most highly valued fabrics in existence. Even in their own day, Sasanian textiles were admired and imitated from Egypt to Japan, and during the Crusades, these pagan products were favored for clothing the relics of Christian saints. When Heraclius captured the palace of Khosrau Parvez at Dastagerd, delicate embroideries and an immense rug were among his most precious spoils. Famous was the winter carpet of Khosrau Anushirvan, designed to make him forget winter in its spring and summer scenes. Flowers and fruits made of interwoven rubies and diamonds grew in this carpet beside walks of silver and brooks of pearls, traced on a ground of gold. Harun al-Rashid prided himself on a spacious Sasanian rug thickly studded with jewelry. Persians wrote love poems about their rugs. Of Sasanian pottery little remains except pieces of utilitarian intent, yet the ceramic art was highly developed in Achaemenid times, and must have had some continuance under the Sasanians to reach such perfection in Mohammedan Iran. Ernest Fenollosa thought that Persia might be the center from which the art of enamel spread even to the Far East. And art historians debate whether Sasanian Persia, or Syria, or Byzantium originated lustreware and cloisonné. Sasanian metalworkers made ewers, jugs, bowls, and cups as if for a giant race, turned them on lathes, incised them with graver or chisel, or hammered out a design in repoussé from the obverse side, and used gay animal forms ranging from cock to lion as handles and spouts. The famous glass cup of Khosrau in the Bibliothèque Nationale at Paris has medallions of crystal glass inserted into a network of beaten gold. Tradition reckons this among the gifts sent by Harun to Charlemagne. The Goths may have learned this art of inlay from Persia, and may have brought it to the West. The silversmiths made costly plate, and helped the goldsmiths to adorn lords, ladies, and commoners with jewelry. Several Sasanian silver dishes survive in the British Museum, the Leningrad Hermitage, the Bibliothèque Nationale, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, always with kings or nobles at the hunt and animals more fondly and successfully drawn than men. Sasanian coins sometimes rivaled Rome's in beauty, as in the issues of Shapur I. Even Sasanian books could be works of art. Tradition tells how gold and silver trickled from the bindings when Mani's books were publicly burned. Precious materials were also used in Sasanian furniture. Khosrau I had a gold table inlaid with costly stones, and Khosrau II sent to his savior, the Emperor Maurice, an amber table 5 feet in diameter, supported on golden feet and encrusted with gems. All in all, Sasanian art reveals a laborious recovery after 4 centuries of Parthian decline. If we may diffidently judge from its remains, it does not equal the Achaemenid in nobility or grandeur, nor the Islamic Persian in inventiveness, delicacy, and taste. But it preserved much of the old virility in its reliefs, and foreshadowed something of the later exuberance in its decorative themes. It welcomed new ideas and styles, and Khosrau I had the good sense to import Greek artists and engineers while defeating Greek generals. Repaying its debts, Sasanian art exported its forms and motives eastward into India, Turkestan, and China, westward into Syria, Asia Minor, Constantinople, the Balkans, Egypt, and Spain. Probably its influence helped to change the emphasis in Greek art from classic representation to Byzantine ornament, and in Latin Christian art from wooden ceilings to brick or stone vaults and domes and buttressed walls. The great portals and cupolas of Sasanian architecture passed down into Moslem mosques and Mughal palaces and shrines. Nothing is lost in history. Sooner or later, every creative idea finds opportunity and development and adds its color to the flame of life. 4. The Arab Conquest. Having killed and succeeded his father, Khosrau I, crowned as Kavad II, made peace with Heraclius, surrendered Egypt, Palestine, Syria, Asia Minor, and western Mesopotamia, returned to their countries the captives taken by Persia, and restored to Jerusalem the remains of the true cross. Heraclius reasonably rejoiced over so thorough a triumph. He did not observe that on the very day in 629 when he replaced the true cross in its shrine, a band of Arabs attacked a Greek garrison near the river Jordan. In that same year, pestilence broke out in Persia. Thousands died of it, including the king. His son, Ardashir III, aged 7, was proclaimed ruler. A general, Shar-Baraz, killed the boy and usurped the throne. His own soldiers killed Shar-Baraz and dragged his corpse through the streets of Ctesiphon, shouting, "Whoever, not being of royal blood, seats himself upon the throne of Persia will share this fate." The populace is always more royalist than the king. Anarchy now swept through a realm exhausted by 26 years of war. Social disintegration climaxed a moral decay that had come with the riches of victory. In 4 years, 9 rulers contested the throne and disappeared through assassination or flight or an abnormally natural death. Provinces, even cities, declared their independence of a central government no longer able to rule. In 634, the crown was given to Yezdegerd III, scion of the house of Sasan and son of a negress. In 632, Muhammad died after founding a new Arab state. His second successor, the Caliph Omar, received in 634 a letter from Muthanna, his general in Syria, informing him that Persia was in chaos and ripe for conquest. Omar assigned the task to his most brilliant commander, Khalid. With an army of Bedouin Arabs inured to conflict and hungry for spoils, Khalid marched along the south shore of the Persian Gulf and sent a characteristic message to Hormizd, governor of the frontier province. "Accept Islam, and thou art safe. Else pay tribute. A people is already upon thee, loving death even as thou lovest life." Hormizd challenged him to single combat. Khalid accepted and slew him. Overcoming all resistance, the Moslems reached the Euphrates. Khalid was recalled to save an Arab army elsewhere. Muthanna replaced him and with reinforcements crossed the river on a bridge of boats. Yezdegerd, still a youth of 22, gave the supreme command to Rustam, governor of Khorasan, and bade him raise a limitless force to save the state. The Persians met the Arabs in the Battle of the Bridge, defeated them and pursued them recklessly. Muthanna reformed his columns, and at the Battle of El Bawaib destroyed the disordered Persian forces almost to a man, this in 624. Moslem losses were heavy. Muthanna died of his wounds, but the Caliph sent an abler general, Sa'ad, with a new army of 30,000 men. Yezdegerd replied by arming 120,000 Persians. Rustam led them across the Euphrates to Qadisiyah, and there through 4 bloody days was fought one of the decisive battles of Asiatic history. On the 4th day a sandstorm blew into the faces of the Persians. The Arabs seized the opportunity and overwhelmed their blinded enemies. Rustam was killed and his army dispersed, this in 636. Sa'd led his unresisted troops to the Tigris, crossed it, and entered Ctesiphon. The simple and hardy Arabs gazed in wonder at the royal palace, its mighty arch and marble hall, its enormous carpets and jeweled throne. For 10 days they labored to carry off their spoils. Perhaps because of these impediments, Omar forbade Sa'd to advance farther east. Iraq, he said, is enough. Sa'd complied and spent the next 3 years establishing Arab rule throughout Mesopotamia. Meanwhile, Yezdegerd, in his northern provinces, raised another army, 150,000 strong. Omar sent him against 30,000 men. At Nahavand, superior tactics won the victory of victories for the Arabs. 100,000 Persians caught in narrow defiles were massacred, this in 641. Soon all Persia was in Arab hands. Yezdegerd fled to Balkh, begged aid of China and was refused, begged aid of the Turks and was given a small force. But as he started out on his new campaign, some Turkish soldiers murdered him for his jewelry, this in 652. Sasanian Persia had come to an end. Book 2, Islamic Civilization, 569 to 1258. Chapter 8, Muhammad, 570 to 632. 1. Arabia. The rediscovery of Arabia by modern Europeans illustrates the internationalism of science in the 19th century. It began in 1761 to 64, when Carsten Niebuhr traveled through the peninsula under the auspices of the Danish government. His published account of 1772 was the first comprehensive description of Arabia. In 1807, Domingo Badia y Leblich, a Spaniard disguised as a Moor, visited Mecca and gave the first accurate account of the pilgrimage ritual. In 1814 to 1815, Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, a Swiss disguised as a Moslem, spent several months in Mecca and Medina. His learned reports were corroborated by later travelers. In 1853, Richard Burton, an Englishman dressed as an Afghan pilgrim, visited Medina and Mecca and described his perilous journey in 2 absorbing volumes. In 1869 to 1870, J. Alevi, a French Jew, explored the sites and recorded the rock inscriptions of the ancient Minian, Sabaean, and Himyarite kingdoms. In 1875, Charles Montague Doughty, an Englishman, traveled from Damascus in the pilgrimage caravan and recorded his vicissitudes in Arabia Deserta of 1888, one of the peaks of English prose. In 1882 to 1888, E. Glaser, an Austrian, in 3 arduous expeditions, copied 1,032 inscriptions, which are now our chief source for the history of pre-Islamic Arabia. In the year 565, Justinian died, master of a great empire. 5 years later, Muhammad was born into a poor family in a country 3/4 desert, sparsely peopled by nomad tribes whose total wealth could hardly have furnished the sanctuary of St. Sophia. No one in those years would have dreamed that within a century these nomads would conquer half of Byzantine Asia, all Persia and Egypt, most of North Africa, and be on their way to Spain. The explosion of the Arabian Peninsula into the conquest and conversion of half the Mediterranean world is the most extraordinary phenomenon in medieval history. Arabia is the largest of all peninsulas. 1,400 miles in its greatest length, 1,250 in its greatest width. Geologically, it is a continuation of the Sahara, part of the sandy belt that runs up through Persia to the Gobi Desert. Arab means arid. Physically, Arabia is a vast plateau, rising precipitously to 12,000 feet within 30 miles of the Red Sea, and sloping through mountainous wastelands eastward to the Persian Gulf. In the center are some grassy oases and palm-studded villages where water can be reached by shallow wells. Around this nucleus, the sands stretch in every direction for hundreds of miles. Snow falls there once in 40 years. The nights cool down to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The daily sun burns the face and boils the blood, and the sand-laden air necessitates long robes and headbands to guard flesh and hair. The skies are almost always clear, the air like sparkling wine. Along the coasts, an occasional torrent of rain brings the possibility of civilization. Most of all on the western littoral, in the Hijaz district with the cities of Mecca and Medina, and southwest in the district of Yemen, the home of the ancient kingdoms of Arabia. A Babylonian inscription of approximately 2400 B.C. records the defeat of a king of Magan by the Babylonian ruler Naram-Sin. Magan was the capital of a Minian kingdom in southwest Arabia. 25 of its later kings are known from Arabian inscriptions that go back to 800 B.C. An inscription tentatively ascribed to 2300 B.C. mentions another Arabian kingdom, Saba, in Yemen. From Saba, or its North Arabian colonies, it is now agreed the Queen of Sheba went up to Solomon about 950 B.C. The Sabaean kings made their capital at Marib, fought the usual wars of defense, built great irrigation works like the Marib dams, whose ruins are still visible, raised gigantic castles and temples, subsidized religion handsomely, and used it as an instrument of rule. Their inscriptions, probably not older than 900 B.C., are beautifully carved in an alphabetical script. The Sabaeans produced the frankincense and myrrh that played so prominent a role in Asiatic and Egyptian rituals. They controlled the sea trade between India and Egypt, and the south end of the caravan route that led through Mecca and Medina to Petra and Jerusalem. About 115 B.C., another petty kingdom of southwest Arabia, the Himyarite, conquered Saba, and thereafter controlled Arabian trade for several centuries. In 25 B.C., Augustus, irked by Arabian control of Egyptian-Indian commerce, sent an army under Aelius Gallus to capture Marib. The legions were misled by native guides, were decimated by heat and disease, and failed in their mission. But another Roman army captured the Arab port of Adana, now Aden, and gave control of the Egypt-India route to Rome. Britain repeated this procedure in our time. In the 2nd century before Christ, some Himyarites crossed the Red Sea, colonized Abyssinia, and gave the indigenous Negro population a Semitic culture and considerable Semitic blood. The term Semitic is due to the legendary derivation of the peoples so-called from Shem, son of Noah. No clear definition of Semite can be given. In general, the populations of Syria, Palestine, Mesopotamia, and Arabia, and the Arab populations of Africa may be called Semitic in the sense that they use Semitic languages. The ancient peoples of Asia Minor, Armenia, and the Caucasus, and the peoples of Persia, North India, most of Europe, and all of the Europeanized Americas may be called Indo-European, as using Indo-Germanic tongues. The Abyssinians received Christianity, crafts, and arts from Egypt and Byzantium. Their merchant vessels sailed as far as India and Ceylon, and 7 little kingdoms acknowledged the Negus as their sovereign. Meanwhile, in Arabia, many Himyarites followed the lead of their king Dunuas and accepted Judaism. With a convert's zeal, Dunuas persecuted the Christians of southwest Arabia. They called to their co-religionists to rescue them. The Abyssinians came, conquered the Himyarite kings around A.D. 522, and replaced them with an Abyssinian dynasty. Justinian allied himself with this new state. Persia countered by taking up the cause of the deposed Himyarites, driving out the Abyssinians and setting up in Yemen in 575 a Persian rule that ended some 60 years later with the Muslim conquest of Persia. In the north, some minor Arab kingdoms flourished briefly. The sheikhs of the Ghassanid tribe ruled northwestern Arabia and Palmyra in Syria from the 3rd to the 7th century as phylarchs or client kings of Byzantium. During the same period, the Lakhmid kings established at Hira, near Babylon, a semi-Persian court and culture famous for its music and poetry. Long before Muhammad, the Arabs had expanded into Syria and Iraq. Aside from these petty kingdoms of south and north, and to a large extent within them, the political organization of pre-Islamic Arabia was a primitive kinship structure of families united in clans and tribes. Tribes were named from a supposed common ancestor, so the Banu Ghassan thought themselves the children of Ghassan. Arabia as a political unit, before Muhammad, existed only in the careless nomenclature of the Greeks, who called all the population of the peninsula Sarakenoi, or Saracens, apparently from the Arabic Sharkiyun, Easterners. Difficulties of communication compelled local or tribal self-sufficiency and particularism. The Arab felt no duty or loyalty to any group larger than his tribe, but the intensity of his devotion varied inversely as its extent. For his tribe he would do with a clear conscience what civilized people do only for their country, religion, or race, that is, lie, steal, kill, and die. Each tribe or clan was loosely ruled by a sheikh chosen by its leaders from a family traditionally prominent through wealth or wisdom or war. In the villages, men coaxed some grains and vegetables from the unwilling soil, raised a few cattle, and bred some fine horses. But they found it more profitable to cultivate orchards of dates, peaches, apricots, pomegranates, lemons, oranges, bananas, and figs. Some nursed aromatic plants like frankincense, thyme, jasmine, and lavender. Some pressed ether, or attar, from highland roses. Some cupped trees to draw myrrh or balsam from the trunks. Possibly 1/12 of the population lived in cities on or near the west coast. Here was a succession of harbors and markets for Red Sea commerce, while farther inland lay the great caravan routes to Syria. We hear of Arabian trade with Egypt as far back as 2743 B.C., probably as ancient was the trade with India. Annual fairs called merchants now to one town, now to another. The great annual fair at Ukaz near Mecca brought together hundreds of merchants, actors, preachers, gamblers, poets, and prostitutes. 5/6 of the population were nomad Bedouins, herdsmen who moved with their flocks from one pasture land to another according to season and the winter rains. The Bedouin loved horses, but in the desert the camel was his greatest friend. It pitched and rolled with undulant dignity and made only 8 miles an hour. But it could go without water 5 days in summer and 25 in winter. Its udders gave milk, its urine provided a hair tonic, its dung could be burned for fuel. The nomad women, says Doughty, wash their babies in camel urine and think thus to help them from insects, and in this water both men and women comb their long hair. When it died, it made tender meat, and its hair and hide made clothing and tents. With such varied sustenance, the Bedouin could face the desert, as patient and enduring as his camel, as sensitive and spirited as his horse. Short and thin, well-knit and strong, he could live day after day on a few dates and a little milk. And from dates he made the wine that raised him out of the dust into romance. He varied the routine of his life with love and feud, and was as quick as a Spaniard, who inherited his blood, to avenge insult and injury, not only for himself but for his clan. A good part of his life was spent in tribal war, and when he conquered Syria, Persia, Egypt, and Spain, it was but an exuberant expansion of his plundering razzias or raids. Certain periods in the year he conceded to the Holy Truce, for religious pilgrimage or for trade. Otherwise he felt the desert was his. Whoever crossed it except in that time or without paying him tribute was an interloper. To rob such trespassers was an unusually straightforward form of taxation. He despised the city because it meant law and trade. He loved the merciless desert because it left him free. Kindly and murderous, generous and avaricious, dishonest and faithful, cautious and brave, the Bedouin, however poor, fronted the world with dignity and pride, vain of the purity of his inbred blood and fond of adding his lineage to his name. On one point above all he brooked no argument, and that was the incomparable beauty of his women. It was a dark, fierce, consuming beauty, worth 1,000,000 odes, but brief with the tragic, hasty fading of hot climes. Before Mohammed, and after him only slightly less so, the career of the Arab woman passed from a moment's idolatry to a lifetime of drudgery. She might be buried at birth if the father so willed. At best he mourned her coming and hid his face from his fellows. Somehow his best efforts had failed. Her winsome childhood earned a few years of love, but at 7 or 8 she was married off to any youth of the clan whose father would offer the purchase price for the bride. Her lover and husband would fight the world to defend her person or honor. Some of the seeds and fustian of chivalry went with these passionate lovers to Spain. But the goddess was also a chattel. She formed part of the estate of her father, her husband, or her son, and was bequeathed with it. She was always the servant, rarely the comrade, of the man. He demanded many children of her, or rather many sons. Her duty was to produce warriors. She was in many cases but one of his many wives. He could dismiss her at any time at will. Nevertheless, her mysterious charms rivaled battle as a theme and stimulus for his verse. The pre-Moslem Arab was usually illiterate, but he loved poetry only next to horses, women, and wine. He had no scientists or historians, but he had a heady passion for eloquence, for fine and correct speech, and intricately patterned verse. His language was closely kin to the Hebrew, complex in inflections, rich in vocabulary, precise in differentiations, expressing now every nuance of poetry, later every subtlety of philosophy. The Arabs took pride in the antiquity and fullness of their language, loved to roll its mellifluous syllables in oratorical flourishes on tongue or pen, and listened with tense ecstasy to the poets who, in villages and cities, in desert camps or at the fairs, recalled to them in running meters and endless rhymes the loves and wars of their heroes, tribes, or kings. The poet was to the Arabs their historian, genealogist, satirist, moralist, newspaper, oracle, call to battle, and when a poet won a prize at one of the many poetry contests, his whole tribe felt honored and rejoiced. Every year at the Ukaz fair, the greatest of these contests was held. Almost daily for a month, the clans competed through their poets. There were no judges but the eagerly or scornfully listening multitudes. The winning poems were written down in brilliantly illuminated characters, were therefore called the Golden Songs, and were preserved like heirlooms in the treasuries of princes and kings. The Arabs called them also mu'allaqat, or suspended, because legend said that the prize poems, inscribed upon Egyptian silk and letters of gold, were hung on the walls of the Kaaba in Mecca. 7 such mu'allaqat, dating from the 6th century, survive from those pre-Islamic days. Their form is the qasida, a narrative ode in elaborately complex meter and rhyme, usually of love or war. In one of them, by the poet Labid, a soldier returns from his campaigns to the village and home where he had left his wife. He finds his cottage empty, his wife gone off with another man. Labid describes the scene with goldsmith's tenderness and with greater eloquence and force. In another, the Arab women prod their men to battle. "Courage, courage, defenders of women! Smite with the edge of your swords. We are the daughters of the morning star. Soft are the carpets we tread beneath our feet. Our necks are adorned with pearls, our tresses are perfumed with musk. The brave who confront the foe we will clasp to our bosoms, but the dastards who flee we will spurn. Not for them our embraces." Unabashedly sensual is an ode by Imrul Qais. Fair too was that other, she the veil-hidden one. How close, how guarded. Yet did she welcome me. Passed I twixt her tent ropes. What though her near of kin lay in the dark to slay me, bloodshedders all of them. Came I at the midnight, hour when the Pleiades showed as the links of seed pearls binding the sky's girdle. Stealing in, I stood there. She had cast off from her every robe but one robe, all but her night garment. Tenderly she scolded, "What is this stratagem? Speak on thine oath, thou mad one, stark is thy lunacy." Passed we out together while she drew after us, on our twin track, to hide it, wise her embroideries. Fled beyond the campfires. There in security dark in the sand, we lay down far from the prying eyes. By her plaits I wooed her, drew her face near to me, one to her waist how frail-lined, hers of the ankle rings. Fair-faced she, no redness, noble of countenance, smooth as of glass her bosom, bare with its necklaces. Thus are pearls yet virgin, seen through the dark water, clear in the sea depths gleaming, pure, inaccessible. Coyly she withdraws her, shows us a cheek, a lip, she a gazelle of Wudra. Roe-like her throat slender, white as an Ariel's, sleek to thy lips uplifted, pearls are its ornament. On her shoulders fallen thick lie the locks of her, dark as the date clusters hung from the palm branches. Slim her waist, a well-cord scarce has its slenderness. Smooth are her legs as reed stems stripped at a waterhead. The morn through she sleepeth, muck-stream in indolence, hardly at noon hath risen, girded her day-dresses. Soft her touch, her fingers fluted as water-worms, sleek as the snakes of Thobia, tooth-sticks of Ishali. Lighteneth she night's darkness, aye, as an evening lamp hung for a sign of guidance lone on a hermitage. The pre-Islamic poets sang their compositions to musical accompaniment. Music and poetry were bound into one form. The flute, the lute, the reed pipe or oboe, and the tambourine were the favored instruments. Singing girls were often invited to amuse male banqueteers. Taverns were equipped with them. The Ghassanid kings kept a troop of them to ease the cares of royalty. And when the Meccans marched against Muhammad in 624, they took with them a bevy of singing girls to warm their campfires and prod them on to war. Even in those early days of ignorance, as Muslims would call the pre-Muslim period, the Arab song was a plaintive cantilena that used few words and carried a note so tenaciously along the upper reaches of the scale that a few verses might provide libretto for an hour. The desert Arab had his own primitive and yet subtle religion. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.